So this is where we left off. But before we do that, we've got two of my children's jokes. Remember, because I'm not a funny person, so I have to have people write my jokes for me. All right, how about this one? What kind of nut doesn't have a shell? What kind of nut doesn't have a shell?
Nutcase?
A nutcase? That's pretty good. You're starting to understand how it works, although you were 201, so. A donut. A donut. All right. Have you guys been to that new donut shop?
The Fraction Fruit?
Yeah. The Fraction Fruit. If you want to pay $25 for a donut, you should check it out. But they're really good, okay? They're just, your whole student loan is going to go to donuts. All right. What type of dance do teachers like best? What kind of dance? Don't worry, I won't demonstrate. Okay, huh? Attendance. Very good. Very nicely done. All right, you guys are already getting the hang of it. All right, so what we need to do is we need to finish out the lecture that we started with the first week of class. I told you that I wasn't going to try to rush. Intentionally, I'm going to work hard to not do that, to make it a habit where we go at the pace that we can go, and then when we need to make up the next week, we will. Okay? Now, there may be a quiz question, pre or post, that shows up of material that we didn't quite get to, and that's one of the reasons that it's important for you guys to be reading the chapter before you come. That's listed on the syllabus, and also previewing the slides, so you'll kind of know, oh, well, we didn't quite finish out the lecture, but I know what slides we're going to start with next week, for example. That being said, did everybody do the pre-quiz by noon today? Okay, sweet. Did you guys get my announcement this morning to remind you? Okay. And then there's a quiz due by Friday at noon. You can take that quiz after class, right? You can take it after SI tonight. You can get some questions answered at SI and then take the quiz tonight and get it out of the way. There's no problem with that. Or you can wait until later this week if you want to spend a little time refreshing and studying topics maybe, or watching the lectures again. So the lectures that are posted, if we've covered the topic, it's from this semester. If we haven't covered the topic, they're from last fall, okay? And you'll notice the difference because I look at a year older, okay? So you'll notice this big difference between last fall and this fall, okay? If I have the same tie on, don't give me a hard time. It was a year ago. I can recycle clothing in a year. So this is where we need to start. But what I want to do is I want to actually just back up one slide and kind of set the stage. Because this is kind of where, this is the last slide content we left off. And I got one comment to adjust the camera because I guess the position last week, it looked like I was just like this floating head on the slide. And I am a little vertically challenged, but I have more than just a head that bobs. So I thought I would at least kind of show the tie. That's why I was thinking of the tie. All right. So we left off here on metaplasia. Now, metaplasia is a reversible pathology. I'm not sure I touched on that last week. We're going to cover it in depth today. But we were talking about cellular metaplasia, where it goes from one form to another type of form. And usually, it's as a result or in response to a stimulus, or, in other words, a irritation or a pathology. In this case, we said that it was gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. And that's where the stomach contents kind of regurgitate back up. The lower esophageal sphincter is weakened, and then you get this heartburn, is what we call it, right, in common vernacular. And we go from the green, which means good, right, or green means go, we see in the esophagus the normal epithelium is being stratified squamous epithelium for the abrasion of when you swallow or ingest food particles. A bolus of food comes down and you want it to have a slippery surface to get down into the stomach. And then here we start seeing a change and definitive cells known as goblet cells, making mucus. And then we get to here, where we're starting today. And the idea of this slide is to describe what happens under a chronic exposure. So if it's a chronic exposure, that means that it lasts over a long period of time, and you get this irritation from the stomach contents, or the acid, that's causing harm to those cells. That's why they've changed to a different cell type. And if it does that long enough, then the stem cells actually become altered. The stem cells that give rise to new tissue in your body, and you have stem cells in almost every organ or tissue of the body we've identified to date. We used to think that there weren't stem cells in the heart, and actually we now found them. They just don't move very readily, so they don't get to where they need to be quick enough, and so you have problems with cardiac regeneration. But there are stem cells that exist in the heart, and they exist actually in the left atrial appendage, if you're interested. Okay? So these stem cells of this tissue now become altered because of this prolonged injury to hydrochloric acid. And just as a review, what is a stem cell? Anybody? What's a stem cell? Don't everybody speak at once.
An undifferentiated cell.
It's an undifferentiated cell. Okay, I like that to start.
It's a cell that gives rise to other cells.
It's a cell that gives rise to other cells. Okay? We'll touch on undifferentiated in a second because there's kind of different levels of undifferentiated. Okay? But that's generally true. So it's a cell that is an early cell. It hasn't been given the signals to tell it what it wants to be when it grows up quite yet. And so there's some plasticity, is the word we use. There's the ability for that cell, under the right influences, to become different types of cells. And so if it's in a less differentiated or an undifferentiated state, and it's given the signals to become new esophageal lining, then it becomes new esophageal lining. Or new skin, it becomes new skin. Okay? In the skin itself, you have a stratum basale layer, which is that deep layer of the epidermis, which is what gives rise to superficial cell layers, and that turns over about every 8 weeks. Okay? Now, there's three main types of stem cells that we find. We see in all of us adult stem cells because we're all adults. In fact, we don't discriminate between embryonic, which is the second type, and adult by age. We discriminate it based upon birth. So once the infant is born, okay, once the in utero delivery takes place, now all of a sudden it becomes adult-derived stem cells. It's like, wow, really? Yeah, the embryo is actually a hypoxic environment. And so its physiology, the fetus and the embryo's physiology is very different than you and I. And the moment that the infant takes its first breath or is put on a respirator, signals of hypoxia in the genes turn off. And one of the first ones we know is called Hypoxia-Inducible Factor, HIF1. So the moment that the infant takes its first breath, we start making totally new physiology. So embryonic stem cells are growing under a hypoxic environment, a low oxygen environment. Once we're born, we actually have a normal physiologic environment, and we call those adult-derived. Now, younger stem cells that are adult-derived, like of an infant or a child, are going to have more plasticity than you and I, or even patients that are 80 plus years of age. But still, we say there's two main sources, adult and embryonic stem cells. Now, the third source is what we call induced pluripotent stem cells. Pluripotent is a word that means many different types of potencies or abilities to become different things. Pluripotent means that it can become many different cell types. And adult-derived stem cells are pluripotent. Embryonic stem cells are what we call totipotent. They can become anything. You go from a single cell to an entire human organism. So totipotent is embryonic stem cell. Pluripotent is adults. And induced stem cells are adult stem cell, IPS cells, induced pluripotent stem cells. They're adult-derived stem cells where we've gone in and manipulated the genes to behave more like an embryonic stem cell. Okay, how do we do that? We do that with different types of transcription factors. And that's all you really need to know for the purposes of this class. So we have three main categories of stem cells. Adult-derived, or let's go from the beginning. Embryonic, adult, and then induced pluripotent. Okay? So in this situation, in a 40-year-old male, we would call these adult stem cells in the esophagus that undergo transformation. Okay? And this is a whole new field of cancer research that we'll talk about a little later this semester, where we're looking at in a cancer cell line or in a tumor, there is a population of cancer stem cells that are the problem. And that's part of the reoccurrence issue. When you kill the cancer stem cell that was there, that initially was mutated, gives rise to the cancer coming back. Question?
Do you say the induced pluripotent stem cells behave, they're changed to behave like everyone?
That's correct. So they're adult-derived stem cells. Induced pluripotent stem cells are adult-derived stem cells that we go in the transcription factors and we induce them to behave more like embryonic stem cells.
So just they're more variable.
So they're more totipotent in their capabilities. Okay, so if we look at this patient population, and why I'm bringing in stem cells is because I'm trying to allude to something we're going to talk about later in the semester with cancer. Because this field of cancer and cancer stem cells is kind of a brand new space that we understand very little about, but we're starting to understand it. And the problem that we're worried about is we're worried about diseases like this leading to cancer. Well, how do they lead to cancer? Well, the clinical scenario is usually a 40 to 60-year-old Caucasian male are the ones that are at highest risk for Barrett esophagus. There's a localized ulceration, usually towards the distal aspect of the esophagus where that injury is repetitively taking place. And if you have greater than 3 centimeters of what we call Barrett mucosa, you increase your risk factor 30 to 40-fold of developing esophageal adenocarcinoma. Okay, and I mentioned that last time, we'll say it again. Esophageal adenocarcinoma, A-D-E-N-O, carcinoma, C-A-R-C-I-N-O-M-A. So it's one word. This is getting you closer and closer to a term known as dysplasia, not metaplasia, but dysplasia. Dysplasia is referring to an abnormal development or growth. And we saw pictures of some early growths, right? Like here. We saw this little lesion that's growing out. So we get metaplasia, which is reversible, to a dysplastic lesion, which is a new growth. It's not supposed to be there. And the issue that we're worried about is getting it to a format that's non-reversible, or which is much closer to cancer, which is this esophageal adenocarcinoma. So this is the motif that we're going to see all semester long. Okay, we're going to have an injury. Something's going to cause that injury. It could be radiation. It could be inflammation. It could be a virus. It could be chemicals, like what's happening here. This is HCl. Okay? It could be pollutants, carcinogens, which are basically chemical agents that you find in the environment, whether it's in your food or whether you're breathing it. Okay? We'll talk about vaping. Okay, I joked about it a little bit earlier, but we'll talk about vaping. It isn't really a safe alternative to classic cigarettes. The answer is no, but we'll get there, okay, in our respiratory section. So, and I don't care what the stores tell you, what the companies tell you, they're a little biased, right? They actually want you to buy that stuff, okay? They make money if they can get you to believe that. So you're going to have some sort of injury. It's going to come in all sorts of different formats. We'll talk about some of them today. That injury is going to cause damage at the cellular level. You get metaplasia. Metaplasia leads to dysplasia, like a growth, an abnormal growth. The cells turn to a different phenotype, and then they give rise to a bigger cell mass. Okay, and that's like, well, they found a lump or a lesion. That's dysplasia. Okay, it's from the Greek root, meaning an abnormal growth. Well, if that continues unchecked and the body doesn't do anything about it, it becomes more and more aggressive. It can cause damage at the level of the DNA. And you get other mutations that take place. And those other additional mutations, one of which could be this ability to metastasize and go other places. So that's kind of the full spectrum that we're going to talk about all semester. And you're going to see one of the big root causes of this cascade of events is inflammation. And so we're going to spend an entire lecture on inflammation. Not today, but we'll talk a little bit about it. Okay? So this example of Barrett esophagus is our first example of the semester, and we're going to see lots of examples. But there's going to be a lot of themes, like this particular disease case that we'll look at. Okay, so here is something very similar, not too far away from the esophagus. This is at the level of the stomach duodenum. So it's on the other side of the stomach, right? The esophagus then leads to the stomach, then it goes to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. You guys remember that? 202? So at the stomach-duodenal interface, this is histology that you would see. So one of the resources we have available in the bookstore is a digital histology DVD. You don't have to buy it. It's not required. I'll show pictures of the stuff that I think I really want you to know, like for the exam. But there might be other things if you just get, curious and you want to, put down your favorite novel and just look at histology, feel free to go get it. Okay? But I will show you what you need in order to be successful in the exam. Clear? But this is where this came from. Both of these examples are on this histology DVD that's in the bookstore. And you see these classic Peyer's patches, right? Peyer's patches are lymphoidal tissue that's found at the duodenal stomach interface because this is the first place where you start absorbing certain things from the outside environment. And so you want this lymphoid organ to be able to handle any type of foreign object that may cause an immunological issue. So you classically see a collection of lymphoid tissue serving that immune function at the duodenal stomach interface. Well, if it's in an ulcer situation, you have a stomach or a small intestine ulcer, you're going to see a very different type of tissue. So you can appreciate there's no Peyer's patches. This tissue here is all inflammatory tissue. How do I know that? Well, if you zoomed in at higher magnification, you would actually be able to appreciate purple dots. All those purple dots, those nuclei, are activated macrophages that are found in that tissue. So you're seeing an alteration, a metaplastic response from this ulcer, where you lose the Peyer's patches, you replace it with inflammation or an inflammatory response, and you see actual scarring or disorganization of the parenchymal tissue of the small intestine. Right? So this open interface right here, this is all new collagen that's laying down. It's a really wide open scar that doesn't function like it's supposed to function in a normal duodenum. Okay, so that's another example of how an inflammatory response is going to cause an issue where you get a metaplastic change. Okay, questions so far? So I really want you to remember from the semester the Barrett esophagus example because it's an irritation. Someone you know probably has heartburn, right? Or GERD. And they probably say something like, it's fine. I take like a Tums and I'm good. Don't worry about it, okay? Well, if you do that for 30, 40 years, you have this chronic irritation, and your risk, if you're a Caucasian male, is about 40 times, as high as 40 times higher of developing esophageal adenocarcinoma, which is throat cancer. Okay? So it is kind of serious. But that's the same thing if, you say, I've had sort of this chronic cough, and I can't get over it, right? Same thing for an asthmatic that doesn't get treated for their chronic asthma. Same thing for patients that have irritable bowels, and they're not managing their irritable bowels. Same thing for patients that have chest pain. So if you don't pay attention to these signals the body gives you, and that stimulus is chronic, it can develop into worse situations. Okay? All right, so everyone's going to make an appointment with their dad next week to go, right? Men are the worst, okay? It doesn't matter their ethnicity. It just happens in this example to be Caucasian males that really don't want to see their physician for their heartburn. Which is kind of funny because one of the spokespersons for a pharmaceutical to treat GERD is actually Larry the Cable Guy. You guys know who that is? So he's like the classic patient. He really is. So they nailed it with that guy. All right.